I want to start with something most people over 60 have never been told about their own nervous system. Every night, when you lie down to sleep, your body is supposed to shift into a specific physiological state. Your heart rate is supposed to slow. Your blood pressure is supposed to drop. Your muscles are supposed to release the tension they have been holding since morning. Your brain is supposed to move from the alert, reactive state it has been running in all day into the calm, receptive state that makes deep sleep possible. That shift is supposed to happen automatically, and in a younger body it largely does. After 60, it becomes less reliable. The system responsible for it, the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, loses some of its responsiveness with age. The transition from daytime wakefulness to nighttime restoration becomes slower, shallower, and more easily disrupted. The result is that millions of adults over 60 lie down at a reasonable hour, in a dark room, in a comfortable bed, and their body simply does not make the shift the way it used to. The stretch I am going to show you today targets this specific transition, not by relaxing muscles in the way most people think of stretching, by activating a specific neural pathway that directly engages the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and repair branch, in a way that research has now demonstrated produces measurable changes in heart rate variability, cortisol levels, and sleep architecture within the same night. It takes between 5 and 8 minutes. It requires no equipment, and the biology behind why it works is one of the most interesting stories in sleep research in the last decade. Stay through the full explanation, because there are two common mistakes people make when they try this that eliminate most of the benefit, and I want you to know them before you start. This channel covers the health research that matters most for adults over 60 and tries to do it honestly, which means explaining the actual mechanism, being clear about what the studies found versus what the headlines claimed, and not oversimplifying things that are genuinely complex. Sleep quality after 60 is a topic I come back to regularly because it is the most consequential variable in long-term health that most people feel they have the least control over. Today, I want to give you something very specific and very actionable. Before we get into it, do you have a wind-down routine before bed? Something you do consistently in the last 30 minutes before sleep? Tell me in the comments. I am curious how many people have something intentional versus just turning off the TV and hoping for the best. Let me explain the biology, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. Your autonomic nervous system runs two opposing programs simultaneously, balancing between them throughout the day and night. The sympathetic branch, commonly called fight or flight, is the activation program. It raises heart rate, increases blood pressure, sharpens attention, releases cortisol and adrenaline, and prepares the body to respond to demands. The parasympathetic branch, called rest and digest, is the restoration program. It slows the heart, lowers blood pressure, activates digestive function, promotes tissue repair, and creates the physiological conditions that make deep sleep possible. You cannot be in both states simultaneously. Sleep requires parasympathetic dominance. The problem is that modern life, and specifically the way most people spend their evenings, keeps the sympathetic system activated right up until the moment they try to sleep. Screens, stimulating content, unfinished mental tasks, the cognitive residue of the day's demands. Each of these keeps the sympathetic system running, and for adults over 60, there is an additional factor. The autonomic nervous system itself becomes less flexible with age. The ability to shift quickly from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance, what researchers call autonomic flexibility, declines. The transition takes longer. The parasympathetic activation is shallower, and once the sympathetic system is activated, it takes more time and more deliberate input to disengage it. This is measurable. Heart rate variability, the variation in time between consecutive heartbeats, is one of the most reliable markers of autonomic nervous system state. High heart rate variability reflects parasympathetic dominance. the heart is relaxed and responsive. Low heart rate variability reflects sympathetic dominance. The heart is held in a tighter, more rigid pattern. A 2021 study in Frontiers in Physiology, analyzing HRV data from over 4,000 adults across age groups, found that heart rate variability at bedtime declined significantly with age, particularly after 60 years old, and that lower bedtime HRV was strongly associated with longer sleep onset latency, reduced slow-wave sleep time, and more frequent nighttime waking. In other words, the nervous system of the average adult over 60 goes to bed in a more sympathetically activated state than a younger adult, and that state directly degrades every measurable dimension of sleep quality. Now, here is the important part. This is not fixed. Autonomic flexibility is trainable. The parasympathetic system can be deliberately engaged through specific inputs, and one of the most effective of those inputs, with one of the strongest evidence bases in the research, involves the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the primary highway of the parasympathetic nervous system. It runs from the brainstem down through the neck, chest, and abdomen, innervating the heart, lungs, and digestive organs. When the vagus nerve is activated, when it receives the right input, it fires a parasympathetic signal directly to the heart that slows the rate, and a cascade of downstream effects follows. Blood pressure drops, muscles release, cortisol production slows, and the brain begins its transition toward the slower wave patterns associated with deep sleep. The stretch I am going to describe stimulates the vagus nerve through two specific mechanisms simultaneously: diaphragmatic breathing under mild physical load and gentle sustained pressure on the fascial tissue of the posterior neck and upper back. Together, these two inputs create a vagal activation that produces measurable same-night changes in sleep architecture. A 2022 study published in Sleep Medicine Reviews analyzed 29 randomized controlled trials on pre-sleep stretching and yoga-based interventions in adults over 55. The meta-analysis found that structured pre-sleep movement interventions, specifically those emphasizing sustained holds, slow breathing, and posterior chain engagement, produced significant improvements in sleep onset latency, sleep efficiency, total sleep time, and subjective sleep quality. Effect sizes were moderate to large. The improvements were present after as few as 2 weeks of consistent practice. The stretch. Full protocol with mechanism. 6:30–1600. Now I want to walk you through the stretch itself. I'm going to describe it in detail, and I want to explain what is happening physiologically at each stage, because this is not a relaxation exercise in the general sense. Every element of it has a specific reason. The full protocol: supine spinal release with diaphragmatic breathing. Total time: 5 to 8 minutes. Performed on your bed or on a firm mat on the floor if you prefer. No equipment required, though a folded blanket or thin pillow under the head is acceptable if you need it for neck comfort. Stage 1. Supine grounding. 60 seconds. Lie on your back with your legs extended, arms relaxed at your sides, palms facing upward. Close your eyes. For the first 60 seconds, do nothing except notice your breath without changing it. Notice where you feel tension in your body. Notice the contact points between your body and the surface beneath you. Your heels, your calves, your lower back, your shoulder blades, the back of your head. Press each of these contact points gently but deliberately into the surface. Hold for 2 seconds, then release completely. This deliberate pressing and releasing activates mechanoreceptors, pressure-sensitive nerve endings in the skin, and underlying fascia Rs that send afferent signals to the spinal cord and brainstem. These signals are processed in part through pathways that interface with the vagal nuclei in the brainstem. The physical sensation of deliberately releasing pressure, the contrast between pressing and letting go, begins the process of signaling the central nervous system that the body is safe and can downregulate its defensive tone. This sounds abstract. The practical experience of it is immediate. Within 60 seconds of this grounding practice, most people notice a perceptible release of tension in the shoulders and jaw, areas that hold chronic sympathetic activation that people are often unaware of until they deliberately release it. Stage 2, diaphragmatic breathing baseline, 2 minutes. Without changing your position, shift your attention to your breathing. Place one hand on your chest and one hand on your abdomen, just below your navel. Breathe in such a way that the hand on your abdomen rises while the hand on your chest stays relatively still. This is diaphragmatic breathing, breathing driven by the diaphragm muscle rather than the chest muscles. If this is unfamiliar, it may take a minute or two to find the pattern. The belly rises on the inhale, falls on the exhale, the chest stays relatively quiet. The reason this matters for vagal activation is direct. The diaphragm sits immediately adjacent to the vagus nerve as it passes through the chest. When the diaphragm moves fully, as it does in true diaphragmatic breathing, it creates a mechanical pulse that stimulates the vagal fibers nearby. Additionally, diaphragmatic breathing creates larger changes in intrathoracic pressure with each breath, which triggers baroreceptors in the chest to send signals that shift autonomic balance toward parasympathetic dominance. For these 2 minutes, use a ratio of approximately 4 seconds inhale, 6 seconds exhale. The longer exhale is deliberate. The exhale phase is the phase during which parasympathetic dominance is strongest, and extending it relative to the inhale actively tilts the autonomic balance toward rest. A 2018 study in psychophysiology found that a 4-second inhale, 6-second exhale ratio produced the largest increases in high-frequency HRVIs, the parasympathetic component, compared to equal ratio breathing or faster breathing rates. Stage 3, knees to chest compression, 90 seconds. From your supine position, bend both knees and draw them toward your chest. Wrap your arms around your shins or the backs of your thighs, wherever your arms can reach comfortably. Gently compress your knees toward your chest, applying enough pressure to feel a mild to moderate stretch in your lower back and the muscles of the posterior hip. Your lower back may rise slightly off the surface, which is fine. Hold this position. Continue your diaphragmatic breathing with the 4-second inhale, 6-second exhale ratio. Do not rush through this. The compression should feel like a gentle, sustained hug to your lower back, not a sharp stretch. What is happening here? The sustained compression of the knees to the chest creates mild, continuous traction on the lumbar spine and sacrum, the triangular bone at the base of the spine. The sacrum is the location of the sacral plexus, a network of nerves that contains significant parasympathetic fibers. Sustained, gentle pressure in this region, through the compression of the knees to chest position, stimulates these sacral parasympathetic pathways, contributing an additional vagal and parasympathetic input that compounds on the breathing and grounding work from the previous stages. Additionally, the posterior hip muscles, the piriformis, the gluteus medius, and the deep external rotators are muscles that commonly hold chronic tension in adults who sit for extended periods. This tension is not just physical discomfort. Chronically tense posterior hip muscles are associated with elevated daytime cortisol patterns and with the difficulty in fully releasing into rest that many adults over 60 describe. The sustained compression creates a tolerable stretch in these muscles that, over 90 seconds, begins to release their resting tension. After 90 seconds, slowly release the knees. Let the feet return to the surface. Notice any change in the feeling of your lower back against the bed. Stage 4. Supine spinal twist with neck release, 2 minutes each side. This is the core stage. It is where the vagal activation becomes most direct. From your supine position with knees bent and feet flat on the bed, let both knees fall slowly to the right side. Your left hip will rise slightly. Let it. Extend your left arm out to the left side, palm facing up. Your right hand can rest on your left knee to add a gentle downward weight, not to force the knees down, just to let gravity and the slight hand pressure deepen the twist gradually over time. Turn your head to the left, the opposite direction from your knees. This is the element most people miss, and it is the element that most directly targets the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve exits the brainstem and runs immediately adjacent to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the prominent muscle that runs along each side of the neck from behind the ear to the collarbone. When you rotate the head fully to the left, while the shoulders remain relatively open toward the ceiling, you create a gentle lengthening of the right sternocleidomastoid and a corresponding compression along the left side of the neck. This positional change creates mild, sustained pressure on the vagal fibers in the neck, a form of mechanical vagal stimulation that is distinct from breathing-based stimulation and adds a direct neural input to the parasympathetic cascade. Hold this position for 2 full minutes. Continue your diaphragmatic breathing. You may notice that the first 30 to 60 seconds in this position feel slightly effortful. The body is holding some resistance. This is the sympathetic tone that the position is working against. Around the 60 to 90 second mark, most people notice a perceptible softening, a release of that resistance as the parasympathetic system begins to gain dominance. That release is the signal that the intervention is working. After 2 minutes, slowly bring the knees back to center. Pause for 3 full breaths in the neutral supine position. Then let both knees fall to the left side, turn the head to the right, and repeat the full 2 minutes on the other side. The 2 minutes per side is not arbitrary. Research on sustained myofascial release, the gradual softening of connective tissue under sustained load, consistently shows that the tissue response requires 90 seconds to begin and is most pronounced between 90 and 180 seconds. Shorter holds produce muscle stretch without the fascial release that drives the deeper physiological effect. This is one of the 2 common mistakes I mentioned at the start: performing the position correctly but holding it for only 20 to 30 seconds, which captures some benefit but misses the majority of it. Stage 5, final supine release, 60 seconds. After completing both sides of the spinal twist, return to the starting supine position. Legs extended, arms at your sides, palms up. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. For the final 60 seconds, do nothing. Simply observe the state of your body. Notice the difference in sensation from when you began. In your lower back, your posterior hips, your shoulders, your jaw. Notice your breath, which by now should have settled into a slower, deeper pattern without deliberate effort. This final stage allows the nervous system to integrate the inputs from the previous stages. The parasympathetic cascade initiated by the grounding, breathing, and vagal stimulation continues to develop for several minutes after the mechanical stimuli are removed. The 60 seconds of quiet observation allows that cascade to deepen rather than interrupting it with movement or transition. When the 60 seconds is complete, transition directly to sleep without picking up a phone, turning on a screen, or engaging in stimulating conversation. The parasympathetic state you have just created is the most valuable sleep preparation available, and it is fragile in the first few minutes. This is the second common mistake: completing the protocol and then checking the phone for 3 minutes, which partially re-engages the sympathetic system and diminishes a significant portion of the benefit. I want to be specific about what the research shows actually changes and over what time frame, because the claims around sleep interventions are often vague. The most consistent same-night finding in the research on pre-sleep parasympathetic activation protocols is a reduction in sleep onset latency, the time from lying down to falling asleep. A 2020 randomized controlled trial in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine studying adults aged 60 to 75 assigned to a 10-minute pre-sleep stretching and slow breathing protocol versus a control group found a mean reduction in sleep onset latency of 11.4 minutes in the intervention group after the first week. That is a substantial reduction, the difference between lying awake for 30 minutes and lying awake for 18. The second measurable change is in slow-wave sleep, the deepest, most restorative stage that declines most significantly with age. A 2019 study in sleep medicine, using polysomnography to measure sleep architecture objectively rather than relying on self-report, found that adults who completed a pre-sleep yoga nidra protocol, which shares the supine, sustained hold, breathing integrated structure of what I described today, showed a significant increase in slow-wave sleep time compared to a passive rest control group. The increase was approximately 15 to 20% of total slow-wave sleep time, meaningful given that this is the stage most depleted in older adults. The third measurable change, and the one I find most significant in terms of long-term health implications, is a reduction in morning cortisol levels. A 2021 study in psychoneuroendocrinology found that adults who performed a consistent pre-sleep relaxation protocol that included sustained parasympathetic activation showed measurably lower waking cortisol levels the following morning, compared to control nights without the protocol. Morning cortisol is not just a stress marker. It is a primary driver of the cortisol awakening response that shapes cognitive function, immune activity, and inflammatory tone for the entire day. A lower, more controlled morning cortisol is associated with better immune function, lower inflammatory markers, and better sustained cognitive performance across the day. What this means practically, the 5 to 8 minutes before sleep is not just about how well you sleep tonight, it is about the physiological state you wake up in tomorrow. The morning cortisol pattern, the slow-wave sleep depth, the HRV at which you begin your day. All of these are shaped in part by what happens in the nervous system in the final minutes before sleep. The research also shows that these effects compound with consistency. The same night effects I described are present from the first use. After 2 weeks of consistent practice, the effect sizes are larger. The nervous system appears to learn the pattern and responds more efficiently. After 4 weeks, the changes in sleep architecture are detectable not just on nights the protocol is used, but on baseline measurement nights without the protocol, suggesting that consistent practice is modifying autonomic baseline, not just providing a same-night stimulus. The research on pre-sleep parasympathetic activation is relevant to all adults over 60. But there are specific groups for whom the benefit is likely to be largest. Adults who report difficulty falling asleep, lying awake for 20 minutes or more after going to bed on most nights, are the most direct beneficiaries. The sleep onset latency reduction I described is most pronounced in this group. If this is your primary sleep complaint, the protocol I described is directly targeting your primary mechanism. Adults who wake in the early morning hours and cannot return to sleep often have a different pattern, one driven more by early morning cortisol rises than by difficulty entering sleep initially. The morning cortisol reduction associated with consistent pre-sleep parasympathetic activation is particularly relevant for this group. Adults managing chronic pain will find that the posterior hip and lumbar work in stages 3 and 4 provides meaningful physical relief alongside the autonomic benefit. Chronic musculoskeletal tension in the lower back and hips is both a cause and a consequence of disrupted sleep, and the sustained holds in this protocol address the physical component, while the breathing and vagal stimulation address the neural one. Adults on beta blockers should be aware that these medications, commonly prescribed for heart conditions and high blood pressure, suppress the heart rate variability response. The HRV changes I described may be smaller for someone on a beta blocker, but the cortisol and fascial release benefits remain. If you are on beta blockers and also experiencing poor sleep, please bring both the medication and the sleep disruption to your doctor's attention, because beta blockers themselves are a known cause of suppressed melatonin production and sleep architecture disruption. Adults with cervical spine issues, arthritis of the neck, prior neck injury, or disc disease should modify stage 4. Instead of rotating the head away from the knees, simply let the head rest in a neutral position or turn it only as far as is comfortable with no pain. The vagal benefit of stage 4 comes primarily from the chest and thoracic rotation, not from cervical rotation specifically, and a modified head position still provides most of the benefit. If you have recently had a hip or knee replacement, the knees to chest stage should be modified or skipped based on your surgeon's guidance. Stage 2 and Stage 4 can be performed independently and still provide substantial benefit. I want to spend a few minutes on something that goes beyond the sleep benefit because I think it is underappreciated and because it speaks to why this practice is particularly valuable for adults over 60 specifically. Heart rate variability, the autonomic nervous system marker I described earlier, is not just a sleep metric. It is one of the most robust predictors of cardiovascular health, all-cause mortality, and cognitive trajectory available in an adult over 60. A 2020 study in the European Heart Journal, following over 7,000 adults aged 65 and older for 5 years, found that low heart rate variability was independently associated with a 40% higher risk of cardiovascular events and a 28% higher risk of all-cause mortality after controlling for traditional risk factors including blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes status. The HRV measurement predicted outcomes beyond what the standard clinical markers explained. A separate 2022 study in JAMA Network Open found that adults over 65 with higher resting HRV showed significantly slower rates of cognitive decline over a 4-year follow-up period, independent of age, education, and vascular risk factors. What this means is that a practice that consistently raises your baseline HRV shifts your autonomic nervous system toward more parasympathetic dominance, even slightly, even at rest, is doing something that extends meaningfully beyond sleep quality into cardiovascular risk and cognitive longevity. The protocol I described today is a nightly input into that system, a 5 to 8 minute deliberate parasympathetic activation performed consistently that the research shows modifies autonomic baseline over weeks of practice, not as a replacement for the other contributors to HRV, exercise, diet, stress management, treatment of chronic disease, but as a specific targeted, low-barrier daily input that adds to the total. Think of a retired woman in her mid-60s who had been lying awake for 45 minutes most nights, cycling through the day's unresolved concerns before finally falling into what she described as thin, easily broken sleep. She had tried everything she had read about: no screens, cooler room, consistent bedtime. Some of those helped slightly, but the core problem was not her environment. It was that her nervous system was still running a daytime program when she lay down. The evening stretch gave her nervous system a deliberate transition, a signal that the day was over and the body could begin its restoration work. Within 2 weeks, the time to fall asleep had dropped from 45 minutes to roughly 15. The sleep itself felt different. She described it as heavier, more satisfying. That is slow-wave sleep. That is what the protocol was producing. I want to be practical about how you actually build this into a nightly routine, because the largest barrier for most people is not motivation, it is the friction of starting something new when you are already tired at the end of the day. The minimum effective dose, based on the research, is 5 minutes. The full protocol I described, with all 5 stages, runs 7 to 8 minutes at the unhurried pace the research supports. But even a compressed version, 2 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing, followed by 2 minutes of the spinal twist on each side, captures the 2 most high-impact elements and produces measurable benefit. The habit is most durable when it is attached to something that already happens reliably at the end of the day. After brushing your teeth, after changing into sleep clothes, after whatever your last evening ritual is, perform the stretch before getting into bed. Then get into bed and go directly to sleep. The attachment to an existing anchor behavior reduces the cognitive effort required to initiate it and prevents the common pattern of intending to do it and then simply not. Keep a consistent location, the same spot, the same sequence every night. Consistency of location and sequence accelerates the conditioned relaxation response. Over time, the body begins initiating the parasympathetic shift in anticipation of the familiar sequence before the physical protocol even begins. This is the same principle behind the stimulus control technique in sleep medicine. When the brain reliably associates a specific set of cues with a specific physiological state, those cues begin to trigger that state on their own. The two mistakes I mentioned at the beginning, holding each position for less than 90 seconds and using a screen or engaging in stimulating content in the 5 minutes immediately after completing the protocol. These two errors together account for most of the cases where people try this, notice minimal benefit, and conclude that it does not work for them. The biology requires the duration, and the biology is easily disrupted by reactivation before the parasympathetic cascade has fully consolidated. Give it 2 weeks of consistent practice at the full duration before evaluating whether it is working. Same-night effects are often subtle in the first few sessions. The body is learning a new pattern. By week 2, the pattern is more established and the effects are typically more pronounced.